Picture this. It's early morning in a remote Siberian forest, June 1908. The air is calm. Nothing seems unusual. And then, without warning, the sky itself seems to catch fire. A blinding flash of light, brighter than the sun, rips across the horizon. Seconds later, a shockwave tears through the wilderness with such force that it flattens 80 million trees across an area the size of a major city, all radiating outward from a single point, as if some invisible giant had simply pushed them all over at once. People hundreds of miles away are knocked off their feet. Windows shatter in towns far beyond the horizon. And yet, when investigators finally reach the site years later, they find something that makes absolutely no sense. There is no crater. Whatever caused one of the most powerful explosions in recorded history left behind almost no physical trace of itself. This is the Tunguska event. And more than a century later, scientists still aren't entirely sure what actually happened that morning. To understand just how strange this event truly is, you first have to understand the sheer scale of what occurred. On the morning of June 30th, 1908, at around 7 in the morning local time, something exploded in the sky above the Podkamena Tunguska River in a remote, sparsely populated region of Siberia. The explosion is estimated to have released energy equivalent to somewhere between 10 and 15 megatons of TNT. To put that into perspective, that's roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. This wasn't a bomb, and it wasn't a volcanic eruption. Whatever it was came from above, and whatever it was, it detonated with a force that dwarfs almost any other natural or man-made explosion ever recorded on Earth. The immediate physical effects were staggering. Approximately 80 million trees across roughly 800 miles of Siberian taiga forest were knocked flat, all lying in a distinctive radial pattern pointing outward from what scientists identified as the epicenter of the blast. This radial flattening pattern is actually one of the most important clues in the entire mystery, because it tells us the explosion almost certainly occurred in the air, above the ground, rather than something that impacted the surface directly. Eyewitnesses living in the sparsely populated region, mostly indigenous Evenki reindeer herders and a handful of Russian settlers, described a fireball crossing the sky, followed by a flash of light so intense that some described it as brighter than the sun, and then a shockwave that knocked people off their feet, shattered windows, and was felt as far as several hundred miles away. Seismic stations as far away as Western Europe registered the shockwaves rippling through the Earth's crust, and atmospheric pressure changes from the event were detected by barometers thousands of miles from Siberia. For years, remarkably, almost nobody investigated the site. Siberia in 1908 was extraordinarily remote, sparsely populated, and difficult to reach, and the political turmoil that would soon engulf Russia, including the First World War and the Russian Revolution, meant that scientific expeditions to the region simply weren't a priority. It wasn't until 1927, nearly 2 decades after the event, that the Soviet scientist Leonid Kulik led the first serious scientific expedition to the site. What Kulik and his team found, and perhaps more importantly, what they didn't find, would go on to deepen this mystery rather than resolve it. Kulik fully expected to find a massive impact crater, evidence consistent with a meteorite strike. Instead, he found something almost impossible to explain. The trees for miles around were knocked flat in that unmistakable radial pattern, consistent with an enormous explosion. Yet at the very center of the blast zone, where the force should have been most concentrated, many trees were still standing upright, though stripped completely bare of their branches and bark. There was no crater. No substantial fragments of any object were found buried in the ground. No substantial metallic debris consistent with a meteorite impact was recovered. It was as though something had exploded with tremendous force high above the forest, without ever actually touching the ground at all. So, if it wasn't a meteorite that struck the Earth directly, what actually caused an explosion of this magnitude? Over the following century, several serious scientific theories have emerged, each attempting to explain both the explosion's incredible power and the strange absence of any impact crater. The leading and most widely accepted theory today is that the Tunguska event was caused by an airburst, the atmospheric explosion of either a stony meteoroid or, perhaps more likely given the specific characteristics of the blast, a fragment of a comet composed largely of ice and dust. Under this theory, the object entered Earth's atmosphere at extremely high speed, and the immense pressure and heat generated by its rapid descent through the atmosphere caused it to disintegrate and explode several miles above the ground before it ever had the chance to reach the surface. This would perfectly explain the absence of a crater, since the object was essentially vaporized in midair rather than striking the ground directly, while still releasing all of its kinetic energy as an enormous atmospheric shockwave capable of flattening forests for hundreds of square miles. Modern astronomers have observed smaller versions of exactly this kind of airburst event in more recent history, most notably the Chelyabinsk meteor event over Russia in 2013, which, while vastly smaller in scale, demonstrated conclusively that objects entering the atmosphere can indeed explode with tremendous force high above the ground without ever creating an impact crater, lending significant scientific credibility to this airburst explanation for Tunguska.
A second theory, closely related to the first but distinct in one key detail, suggests that the object responsible was specifically an icy cometary fragment rather than a rocky asteroid. This theory helps explain a puzzling secondary detail from the historical record. In the days and weeks following the explosion, unusually bright night skies were reported across Europe and parts of Asia, sometimes described as bright enough to read a newspaper by at midnight. If the object was indeed a fragment of a comet, largely composed of ice, dust, and volatile compounds, its disintegration in the upper atmosphere could have released a significant amount of fine dust particles into the high atmosphere, which would then scatter sunlight in a way that could plausibly explain these unusually bright skies observed thousands of miles from the actual explosion site. This theory remains difficult to fully confirm, however, since no confirmed fragments of the object, cometary or otherwise, have ever been definitively recovered from the region, leaving the exact composition of whatever exploded that morning still fundamentally unknown. The third and far more speculative set of explanations ventures well beyond mainstream astronomy and into far more unconventional territory. Because no confirmed physical fragments of the object were ever recovered, and because the event remains genuinely unprecedented in the historical record, a number of alternative theories have emerged over the decades, ranging from a small black hole passing through the Earth to antimatter colliding with ordinary matter to even more fringe suggestions involving an alien spacecraft. It's important to be clear that virtually none of these more speculative theories have any meaningful scientific support, and most mainstream astronomers consider the airburst explanation, whether from an asteroid or comet fragment, to be overwhelmingly the most likely cause. However, the sheer scale of the unanswered questions surrounding Tunguska, the total absence of any confirmed debris, the complete lack of an impact crater, and the sheer magnitude of the explosion itself has left just enough uncertainty that more unconventional theories have continued to circulate in popular culture for over a century, even as serious scientific consensus has remained firmly rooted in the airburst explanation. What makes the Tunguska event endure as one of the most compelling mysteries in modern scientific history isn't really the question of whether it happened, the physical evidence for that is completely undeniable, but rather just how much remains genuinely unknown, despite more than 100 years of dedicated scientific investigation. We know an object entered Earth's atmosphere and exploded with almost unimaginable force. We know it flattened an area of forest larger than many major cities. We know it was detected by seismographs and barometers across the entire planet. And yet, we still don't know with absolute certainty what that object actually was, where exactly it came from, or why it left behind so little physical evidence of its own destruction. It stands today as a sobering reminder that Earth remains vulnerable to impacts from space on a scale that could threaten entire regions, and that even in an age of advanced science and satellite monitoring, we still don't have a complete answer for exactly what happened over Siberia on that June morning in 1908. So, after everything we've explored, the almost unimaginable force of the explosion, the total absence of any impact crater, and the competing scientific explanations of an asteroid airburst, a cometary fragment, or the more speculative alternative theories, what do you think actually exploded over Tunguska that morning? Do you think it was a fragment of an asteroid comet that disintegrated in the atmosphere? Or do you think there's still something about this event that mainstream science hasn't fully figured out? Let us know what you think in the comments below.